January 23, 1943, Lake Ladoga, Eastern Front, minus 35 °C. Wind chill at flight level, minus 47 °C. Visibility, variable, moderate fog, light snow. Engine compression at 60%. Cabin heat disabled. Altimeter unreliable. The Ilyushin DB-3 twin-engine bomber drifted under a ceiling of broken grey clouds, her left nacelle trembling under the weight of wind shear and residual frost. Inside, Senior Lieutenant Alexei Mikhailovich Volodin tightened his grip on the throttle, his eyes locked on the white horizon ahead. Everything beneath him, everything that looked like ground, was ice. Frozen lake. Flat, endless, and quietly deadly. He couldn't see the makeshift landing zone. There were no markings, no flares, no signal units. The Germans had shelled the last aid station on the ice 2 days ago, and the artillery teams hadn't yet restored guidance for incoming aircraft. He flew blind, trusting only the faint black line someone had etched in charcoal across the surface 4 days ago, a line that had now mostly blown away in the drift. The bomber wasn't carrying bombs. Not today. In its fuselage, laid across crates of ammunition, were 8 soldiers, 5 wounded, 3 in shock. Their unit had been stranded on the western bank of the Neva, caught in crossfire and starvation. This was a mercy flight, a rescue. Volodin reached down and flicked off the undercarriage lock. The landing gear stayed retracted. His co-pilot, Sergeant Dobrinin, blinked and leaned toward the control panel, uncertain. "You forgot the gear," he murmured. Volodin didn't respond. Dobrinin checked again. No deployment. "Alexei, the gear, I know." The DB-3 dipped low, the roar of her engines swallowed by the white silence of the lake. At 90 meters, turbulence smacked the wing. Volodin corrected with barely a flick of the stick. At 40 meters, the fog deepened. Ice below vanished in glare. He tilted the nose up slightly and cut the throttles. Dobrinin tensed. "You're going to belly her in?" Volodin's jaw tightened. "The gear will snap. She's too heavy. We don't land on ice with wheels anymore." There was no time to argue. The horizon disappeared. The surface rushed up. And then, with the shriek of steel against frozen glass, the DB-3 slammed into the ice at over 150 kilometers per hour, not on her wheels, but on her armored belly. The plane groaned. The frame screamed. The steel skin sparked, scraping across the rough surface of the lake like a dying ship against reef. Inside, men shouted. One vomited. The crates shifted, slammed, but the wings held. The fuselage held. The aircraft did not break apart. She slid 60-70 meters, losing speed in a long horizontal descent until finally, with a dying sigh, she stopped. Snow swirled around her. Stillness. Then, hatches opened. The wounded were pulled free. Medics rushed from a distant shelter. Volodin sat still for a moment, hands on the stick, breath visible in the frozen cockpit air. No one clapped. No one cheered. There was no time for that, but someone saw what he'd done, and within 2 weeks they would all be doing it too. He wasn't a hero, not then. Not now. Alexei Mikhailovich Volodin had grown up in Tobolsk, the son of a timber transport inspector and a schoolteacher. He had flown bush planes for 6 years before the war, delivering parts and people across rivers and frozen tundra where there were no runways, no towers, and no airstrips. In Siberia, landing meant putting wheels down on logging roads, frozen swamps, or in winter, slabs of lake ice with barely enough thickness to hold a plane. He learned early. Wheels lie. Ice punishes. So he stopped trusting gear. He learned to feel the angle of descent through his spine. Learned how to read wind by the way trees bent. How to judge surface tension by the texture of snow drifts from 300 meters. It wasn't training. It wasn't science. It was instinct born of repetition and failure. He crash-landed 4 times before his 30th birthday. Never lost a man. When the war came, he was drafted as an auxiliary pilot, not frontline, not elite. He flew deliveries, ammunition, fuel drums, radio batteries, and eventually the wounded. But the winter of 1943 was different. The siege of Leningrad had pushed Soviet supply to its limits. The only reliable corridor in or out of the city was over Lake Ladoga, frozen solid but treacherous. Trucks ran across it at night, lights off, engines rattling. The path was called the Road of Life. But life didn't always arrive. German artillery found the route daily. Luftwaffe spotters tracked convoys. Bombers dropped payloads blindly, hoping to score hits on trucks in the mist. But more dangerous than all of that was the ice itself. In January alone, 26 aircraft attempted landings on the lake. 14 crashed. 6 broke through the surface entirely and vanished, dragging pilots and medics into the blackness. Command began halting medical flights. Volodin refused. When asked why, he answered with one phrase, "We are not landing. We are arriving." His commander stared at him like he was mad. But Volodin explained, and then he proved it. His method was simple in concept, insane in execution. He stripped weight where possible, removing floor panels, seats, even interior wiring from the cockpit. He stopped using standard ski landing gear, which often caught on rough patches or fractured ice. He left the wheels retracted. Instead, he reinforced the lower fuselage with steel plating salvaged from destroyed armored cars. He lined the contact surface with thick rope and strips of frozen horsehide, oiled and frozen into rigidity to reduce friction. He adjusted his glide path, lower angle, longer approach. He called it the belly slide. Other pilots called it suicide, but he did it again, and again, and again. By the end of February, he had completed 14 belly slide landings, all successful, all on ice that had broken under wheel-based aircraft. Then others began to try. At first, only his mechanic, a veteran named Mitya Gorenko, believed in the method. Gorenko had seen too many broken bodies pulled from the lake. He started reinforcing the bellies of other planes in secret, without permission. He used scrap from tank skirts, panzer hulls, anything that could take abrasion. Soon the crews caught on. They began painting lines on the inside of the cockpits, one for every successful slide. Volodin had 18. He never painted his own. Others did it for him. There was no manual. There were no diagrams. The slide was never approved by the Air Command, but within the airfields of the Leningrad sector, pilots began whispering, talking in hushed tones around stovepipes and gasoline fires. Young airmen asked to sit in Volodin's cockpit before takeoff, just to see the switches he used. Others traced the route his hand took on final descent. They said his fingers twitched just before flare. They said he could hear the thickness of ice from 30 meters. They said the air moved differently for him. None of it was true. He was just a man who had spent a decade flying where ice was the only runway, and who knew that landing wasn't about technology. It was about surrendering the idea of control. March brought thaw. The top layer of ice softened. Snow melted. But the lake remained frozen underneath, now more unpredictable than ever. Pilots were ordered to stop using the route. Volodin flew twice that week. Both times he landed on shadow, aiming not for open snow but for the faint grey streaks where surface tension remained strong. He called them bone zones. He was never wrong. On March 17th, a German observer plane spotted him making a sliding landing and assumed it was a crash. The Luftwaffe began broadcasting footage of what they claimed was a desperate Soviet defeat. The next day, Volodin took off from the same spot, waved at a forward infantry post as he passed, and vanished into fog. The German footage was never corrected, but among Soviet pilots it became legend. They began referring to him not by name, but by whisper. Lyodovik, the Iceman. When the ice finally gave way in April, the land corridor opened and air traffic moved to paved strips. The slide was over, but not forgotten. Of the 28 aircraft Volodin landed via belly slide between January and April, 25 survived. 2 were damaged beyond repair. 1 was written off due to structural fatigue. 0 fatalities. Total cargo delivered, 190 tons. Wounded evacuated, 114. Pilots saved by his training, unknown. But the scars on the lake, the scraped trails through the ice, remained for weeks, long after the snow melted. He died 3 years later, in 1946. Not in war, not in ice, but in a factory, crushed beneath a transport crane during a training exercise for a new cargo aircraft. The report called it an industrial accident, no ceremony, no recognition. But his old mechanic, Gorenko, was there. He carried a piece of DB-3 fuselage in his coat pocket, torn from a plane that had skidded across Lake Ladoga in a storm and landed with all souls aboard. He buried it with him, and on the back of Volodin's grave marker, he etched one word in a child's penknife: arrived. In the years that followed, no official doctrine of the Soviet Air Force ever included Volodin's method. The term slide appeared only once in the margin of a handwritten winter operations memo filed in 1952 by a logistics officer in Karelia who had flown a battered Lisunov Li-2 over frozen lakes during a storm and landed without gear. The officer survived. The plane didn't, but he wrote in the margin, "This worked once. The technique is insane, like that man in Ladoga. They said he slid them home. No one could verify it, no one tried. But the method reappeared, not in textbooks, not in orders, but in muscle memory, in the hesitations of cold hands reaching for the gear lever above Arctic snow, in the last-minute decision not to lower wheels when the wind hissed strangely across the surface, in places like Magadan, Yakutsk, Pechenga, Murmansk. In 1959, during a reindeer supply drop in the Chukotka Peninsula, a transport pilot skidded a Yak-12 tail first onto permafrost after the wheels froze solid. He was commended for intuitive reaction under conditions of zero visibility. When later interviewed by a junior flight officer, he described his action as, "I had no choice. I slid her in. Like that story. You know the one. The Iceman." But by then, Leodovic was a ghost. His name had become dissociated from his body. He was myth, which was exactly how the memory survived. Back during the war on the 4th day after Volodin's 20th belly slide, the ice cracked beneath his left wing after touchdown. The surface gave just slightly. Not a collapse, but enough to list the aircraft hard to starboard. The sled runners mounted to the fuselage's underbelly caught the edge of a fissure. The entire plane tilted. The nurse aboard screamed. Crates shifted violently. The fuel tank bent. Volodin kept his hand on the throttle. He didn't cut power. Instead, he accelerated. Not to take off, and there wasn't enough room, but to complete the slide and force the momentum forward. The engines screamed. The propellers clawed frozen air. The aircraft jerked, snapped, and broke free of the fissure, skidding violently in a half-circle before finally stopping. One man had broken an arm. All others lived. That moment, that exact decision, was watched from the shore by another pilot, Lieutenant Pavel Ignatiev, grounded for frostbite. He later recounted the landing to an intelligence officer and said, "He didn't land. He surfed on death." Ignatiev went on to command an Arctic aviation school. His students trained belly landing techniques on dry sand. They thought it was for emergencies, but he called it the Ladoga exercise. He never explained the name. Meanwhile, Volodin's modified aircraft were quietly rotated out of use. The DB-3s he flew, patched with tank metal, ropes, and leather strips, were deemed unsuitable for redeployment. Command believed them compromised by unauthorized modification. One officer recommended scrapping the entire fleet. Instead, the field crews refused. Without filing requests, they repurposed the aircraft into stationary training platforms for Arctic takeoff procedures. The planes never flew again. But cadets climbed inside them and listened to lectures from sergeants who in their youth had watched the slide happen in real time. A photograph exists, black and white, taken in late March 1943. It shows a wide shot of Lake Ladoga from a reconnaissance position near the shoreline. Faint in the upper right corner is a plane, lower than it should be, angled downward with no landing gear visible, casting a long shadow against the flat ice. The image is unremarkable to the untrained eye, but if you've seen a slide, you recognize it instantly. That photo sat in a drawer for 70 years before a historian named Irina Voskresenskaya found it. She had been researching unorthodox flight methods of the Eastern Front for a military aviation exhibit in Minsk. When she saw the photo, she paused, then turned it over. On the back, handwritten in pencil, "Letchik bez koles," the pilot without wheels. It was unsigned, but that too was appropriate. Volodin never signed anything. He simply flew. Not long before the end of the war, a political officer visited the Leningrad airfield where Volodin had once flown. The officer, a young man with a clean uniform and no frost on his boots, requested a full accounting of unauthorized technical behaviors committed by pilots during the siege. He spoke formally. He used words like protocol, deviation, and centralization. When the officer asked about the slide, the quartermaster said nothing. When he asked again, the chief mechanic pretended not to hear. When he pressed, a retired radio operator finally answered, "Some of us still walk, comrade, even when others forget the trail." The officer left with nothing. The files were never updated. But a few weeks later, the mechanic received a request, informal, unsigned, for a schematic of the modifications made to Volodin's aircraft. It came wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a single note. "In case the next war forgets." He never replied, but he made the diagram. In 1947, in a rural village near Viritsa, an aviation student asked an elderly man chopping firewood if he had ever seen planes land on the lake during the war. The man didn't answer. Instead, he dropped the axe, limped into a tool shed, and returned with a dented metal panel wrapped in canvas. He unrolled it slowly, as if revealing a relic. Along the edge were deep gouges, curved and scorched, as if scraped across something impossibly hard. The student asked what it was. The man said, "It's what survived." Later, the student tried to donate the piece to a museum. They declined. Too damaged, no provenance. But he kept it. And when he became an instructor at the Civil Aviation College in Novosibirsk, he mounted it on the wall above the simulators. No plaque, no explanation. Just metal, just memory. Volodin's name never appeared in official wartime commendations. He was recommended once for the Medal for Courage, but the paperwork stalled when a senior officer challenged the validity of non-standard landings. Another citation for the Order of the Red Star was withdrawn when it became clear that the pilot had modified aircraft without approval. But in 1954, a flight safety committee conducting research on non-gear landings under compromised conditions referenced a pilot only as Subject V. The dossier included sketches of modified fuselage plating, estimates of friction on frozen lake surfaces, and one haunting sentence underlined in red. Subject V demonstrates that absence of protocol is not the same as absence of control. The report was buried, but not forgotten. In 1991, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, archives in the Leningrad Oblast were hastily opened to civilian review. Most were disorganized, files lost, papers missing. But in one sealed folder marked Unorthodox Aviation 1943, there was a page, yellowed, fragile, bearing a line diagram of a DB-3 with annotations in pencil. The belly was shaded in gray, marked Ice Contact Point, Slide Zone. In the corner, a small signature, MV, likely the initials of a mechanic, or perhaps a pilot. In 2008, a Russian documentary crew researching forgotten WPU airfields interviewed elderly villagers near the old Ladoga route. One woman, wrapped in scarves, pointed at the lake and said, "There used to be a man who flew without wheels. He would come at dusk, like a hawk across the ice, and then he would vanish." When asked his name, she shrugged. Maybe Alexei, maybe not. He was always moving, he didn't want to be thanked, just pointed to the wounded and left again. The crew asked if anyone else remembered. She shook her head. Only the lake. But it's quiet now. Time did not polish the slide into legend. It eroded around it. The technique was never named in formal literature, never codified in military doctrine, and never taught explicitly in flight schools. But traces remained. Not in text, in behavior. In the way certain pilots flying over taiga or Arctic desolation reached instinctively for the flap lever sooner, in the way they looked down at frozen rivers not as hazards, but as reluctant allies, in the way they hesitated a breath before deploying landing gear on uncertain terrain. In 1976, during a debrief after a narrow emergency landing on a frozen steppe outside Norilsk, a seasoned cargo pilot was asked why he hadn't dropped his wheels before touchdown. The pilot, a veteran of Korea and multiple Soviet civilian routes, answered without hesitation, "There are ghosts on the ice. They teach you to stay flat. No one questioned it. The report was marked inconclusive and filed away. But the aircraft was saved, and the crew walked away. In 2014, a university researcher investigating field engineering adaptations in Soviet aircraft came across a peculiar set of reports from the winter of 1943. The casualty statistics for air transport units in the Leningrad theater showed a baffling anomaly. During the months of January to March, survival rates for landings on Lake Ladoga were higher in units that had no documented ski or wheel gear usage. The numbers didn't make sense, until she cross-referenced them with an unrelated oral history from a retired female medic who had served near the lakeshore. The medic, nearly blind, recounted watching a plane arrive with no landing gear, scraping the ice, sliding, but not crashing. I thought he was dead. Then he stood up in the cockpit and waved. The researcher paused. She began looking for patterns in the old fuselage schematics, examining undercarriage reports, and searching for any trace of formal mentions of such techniques. She found only one. In the footnote of a winter logistics report, faded by time, nearly illegible. Alternative descent strategy reported, not recommended, but proved effective. There was no author listed, no date, just the lingering hesitation of a war that had been too big, too brutal, and too bureaucratic to celebrate the man who had figured out how to land without wheels. Somewhere, on a shelf in a cold warehouse near Murmansk, there still sits the rear assembly of a DB-3 bomber. The fuselage was too damaged to display, but the belly is intact, scarred, grooved, but whole. It had been recovered from beneath tarpaulins that once lined a field hangar now lost to moss and time. A young technician found the piece by accident. He noticed that the underbelly had been reinforced with what looked like tank armor. He showed it to his supervisor. The supervisor frowned. What the hell were they doing with this? The young man shrugged. They landed it somehow. No one filed a report, but the piece stayed on the shelf. And some nights, when the wind howls and the snow pounds the roof like the echoes of old propellers, the younger men joke that the ghost of Leodovic is coming in for one last slide. But the older men, they don't laugh. They just nod and glance toward the ice. It is difficult to preserve what was never officially recorded. A war that left behind millions of reports, medals, citations, and ceremonies has almost no place for a man who changed everything by refusing to follow the book. But then again, Volodin's legacy was never meant to be read. It was meant to be felt. In the cold grip of steel against air, in the silence between wing and ice, in the gasp that escapes when an aircraft touches down where no plane should ever land and yet somehow survives. In 2021, a restoration project began on one of the few surviving DB-3 airframes found in a collapsed barn near Veliki Novgorod. The plane had been stripped bare, long since gutted, but its serial number traced it back to the 13th Transport Squadron. When the restoration crew reached the undercarriage, they noticed something strange. The lower fuselage was coated in uneven weld lines, not factory work, field patches. Beneath the belly were scratch marks that didn't match skidware. They were curved, consistent, directional, and there, etched faintly into one of the makeshift armor panels, barely visible beneath layers of oxidized paint, a word in block Cyrillic, Prebol, arrived. There was no signature, no rank, just the word. It wasn't carved for memory, it was carved for truth, because that was the only thing Volodin ever chased, the arrival, not the glory. The line drawn between life and death was not a medal, not a citation, not a banner dropped from a tower. It was a thin, invisible seam across a frozen lake, measured not in meters, but in instinct, fear, and precision. His technique did not stop wars, it did not change the tide of Leningrad, it did not receive a parade, but it delivered 100, maybe 200 men, wounded, freezing, barely alive, to safety when no other system worked. It saved radios that helped coordinate counter-offensives. It delivered crates of code equipment, medical supplies, artillery fuses. It moved war forward by refusing to let ice decide where death belonged. And that, in the unforgiving arithmetic of total war, was enough. That was everything. There are no statues of Alexei Mikhailovich Volodin. There are no schools named after him. But in a small hangar in Pskov, An aging pilot keeps a copy of the old slide diagram folded behind a photo of his father, a mechanic who once reinforced belly plates with his bare hands. On quiet mornings, the pilot unfolds the paper. He reads the old notations, and he whispers like a prayer, "Nose up, gear in, hold the air, let her slide," because some truths never die. They just wait beneath the snow and rise again when someone, somewhere, looks at a flat stretch of ice, feels the fear press behind their ribs and chooses to land anyway. Not because it's smart, not because it's brave, but because they remember the Iceman, and because the next life waiting to be saved is worth every centimeter of the slide.